All right, let's talk about Vikings. Those bearded, battle-hungry Norsemen who basically set the early medieval world on fire. Sometimes literally. Now, forget the horned helmets and wild screaming. We'll get to that myth later. Today, we're diving into the real Viking arsenal. From axes that doubled as deadly tools to swords so precious they were basically the Viking version of a sports car, and spears that poked their way through history. We're breaking down the weapons, the techniques, and the myths they left behind. So grab your shield, but maybe skip the mushrooms and let's go raiding through history. Let's kick things off with the Vikings' best friend. Not a wolf, not a raven, not even a drinking horn. Nope, it's the axe. Now, I know what you're thinking. Big, scary, bearded guy swings a giant axe and splits someone in half. That's actually not too far off. But it's way more interesting than that. You see, the axe was the most iconic and most common weapon in a Viking's toolkit. And I say toolkit because that's exactly where it started, as a tool. Vikings didn't just use axes to bash skulls. They used them to chop wood, build longhouses, carve ships, and maybe even open the occasional mead barrel. It was like the medieval Swiss Army knife, if your Swiss Army knife could also cleave through chainmail. But don't get it twisted. These weren't crude farm tools. The axes used in battle were finely crafted, efficient, and varied. There were two main types, the small hand axe and the larger, more fearsome Danish axe, also known as the broadaxe. The hand axes were lightweight, easy to carry, and quick to swing, perfect for dual wielding or even throwing at your enemies. Yes, Vikings threw their axes like they were auditioning for a medieval action movie. And archaeologists have found dozens of throwing axes, like the ones uncovered at the Viking trading site of Birka in Sweden, suggesting they were more than just backup weapons. Now, the Danish axe? That's where things get intense. This was a two-handed monster with a shaft up to 5 feet long and a curved blade big enough to make a modern lumberjack weep. Designed for open battlefield carnage, the Danish axe could cleave through helmets, shields, and occasionally a man's dignity. And yet, here's where the craftsmanship comes in. These blades weren't just huge lumps of iron. Viking smiths used pattern welding, combining different types of iron and steel to make the blades both flexible and sharp. The edges were often made from carbon steel, hammered thin and sharpened to a surgical edge. Take the Mammon axe, discovered in a wealthy Danish burial mound, dated to around 970 AD. This thing is a masterpiece. It's small enough to be wielded one-handed, but covered in intricate silver inlays, runic decorations, and Christian symbols. But it wasn't just about hacking and slashing. Viking warriors were tacticians, and they used axes in clever ways, hooking enemy shields, pulling riders off horses, or even using the backspike of some axe types to pierce armor. Some had bearded blades, curved and flared to snag an enemy's limb, or yank down their shield with a twist of the wrist. And because axes were so common and relatively inexpensive to make, even lower-class warriors and farmers could arm themselves effectively. That meant when the call to raid or defend came, you didn't need to be rich or royal, you just needed your trusty axe and maybe a bit of courage. Let's be honest, if you're stuck in a muddy battlefield in 9th century England, you'd want an axe too. Especially one that doubled as your hammer, saw, crowbar, and, if necessary, intimidation tool. And yes, contrary to what video games might suggest, dual-wielding axes was not unheard of. But it was risky. Cool, but risky. Most Viking fighters opted for one axe and a shield, giving them the perfect blend of offense and defense. The whole whirlwind of axe fury thing? That was for the bold, or the slightly unhinged. So next time someone says, Vikings just swung around big axes, you can say, actually they engineered and wielded them with precision, and some of them were literal works of art buried with elite warriors for the afterlife. Boom. Axe dropped. All right, if the Viking axe was the everyman's weapon, the blue-collar blade of the Norse world, then the sword was the Viking equivalent of pulling up in a custom chariot with gold rims and a fur interior. This wasn't your average tool-turned-weapon. The sword was status, prestige, and pure flex. Owning one meant you either had wealth, connections, or a very lucky raid on some unsuspecting monastery. And let's be clear, these swords weren't just sharp slabs of metal, they were crafted, balanced, elegant, and surprisingly short by modern fantasy standards. Most Viking swords were around 28 to 36 inches long, double-edged, and designed for one-handed use. Because the other hand was busy holding a shield, or gesturing dramatically as you told your saga. The Viking sword was not built for wild hacking. It was meant for controlled, fast strikes, defensive parries, and thrusts in tight combat. We're talking close quarters, shield wall to shield wall, no room for spinning pirouettes. And you didn't just use it, you named it. Yes, Viking swords had names like Legbiter, Woundfire, or Battleflame. Because let's be honest, it's way more intimidating to yell, "Face the wrath of Skullsplitter," than "Hold still while I jab you with this pointy stick." Let's talk about the Ulfbert sword. This was the Rolls-Royce of Viking blades. Over 170 of these have been found, stretching from Scandinavia to Eastern Europe. And they're special, not just because they were etched with the mysterious inscription Ulfbert, but because they were made with exceptionally pure crucible steel. That kind of steel wasn't native to Europe at the time. It had to be imported, possibly from Persia or India. And here's the kicker. These swords had carbon contents as high as 1.0 to 1.2%, compared to the average 0.5% in normal Viking steel. That means they were stronger, sharper, and less likely to shatter during a fight. Basically, an Ulfbert was the difference between winning the battle or becoming someone else's victory toast. Oh, and if you couldn't afford a real Ulfbert? No worries. Knockoffs existed. That's right. Viking bootlegs. Swords that looked like the real thing, but were made with inferior steel. You think counterfeit luxury goods are a modern problem? Think again. And Viking burial sites back this up. High-status graves like those at Birka in Sweden or Gokstad in Norway often include ornately decorated swords with inlaid hilts, silver wire grips, and engraved pommels. These weren't just weapons. They were heirlooms, family treasures. Some were even bent or killed before burial so the dead could take their blade to Valhalla without worrying it'd be stolen in the afterlife. But swords weren't for everyone. They were expensive to make and maintain. So if you had one, you were either a war chief, a noble, or just very, very lucky. Also worth noting, Viking swords weren't all locally made. Many were imported from the Carolingian Empire, which is why Emperor Charlemagne eventually banned sword sales to Scandinavia. His logic? If I sell them swords, they're going to stab me with them. Spoiler alert, he was right. The Vikings got the swords anyway. Trade embargo? Please. They were Vikings. So if the axe was for doing the job, the sword was for looking good while doing it. Okay, so axes are brutal. Swords are classy. But the real MVP of the Viking battlefield? The spear. Now I know. When people imagine Vikings, they picture swinging axes, not throwing spears. But here's the deal. If you were a Viking warrior, chances are your weapon of choice wasn't a sword or an axe. It was a spear. Why? Because they were cheap, effective, and incredibly versatile. Also, you could make one with a stick and some metal. Boom! Instant pointy death stick. Affordable and lethal. Viking spears came in two main flavors. Throwing spears, aka fraka. Thrusting spears, for up-close and personal stabbing. And when I say throwing spears, I don't mean like a javelin toss at a high school track meet. These things were meant to split up the enemy, break shield formations, and sow absolute chaos. You'd chuck a few spears, then close in with your shield and melee weapon, assuming you weren't already getting poked yourself. The thrusting spears were longer, designed for fighting in formation, which, yes, Vikings did use. Despite what TV shows make you think, they didn't just run into battle screaming like banshees. When things got real, they'd form a shield wall, and guess what? A row of spears poking out from behind those shields was like the medieval version of a porcupine with an attitude. Want archaeological proof? At Birka, one of Sweden's most famous Viking-era trading and burial sites, dozens of spearheads have been found, some plain and deadly, others elaborately decorated. In one grave, archaeologists discovered 3 different spears buried with the same warrior. That's not redundancy. That's a man who really believed in options. Some spearheads were leaf-shaped, others had barbed edges, and a few even featured winged lugs, those little side hooks that could trap or rip through enemy gear. Not just practical, but mean. And here's a wild fact. Some Viking spears were so finely crafted with pattern-welded steel and ornamental inlays that they likely belonged to elite warriors or noblemen. Just because it's a spear doesn't mean it can't be fabulous. And let's not forget the symbolic power of the spear. The Norse god Odin, the All-Father himself, wielded one, Gungnir, forged by dwarves, blessed to never miss its mark. So yeah, when you fought with the spear, you were in pretty divine company. Even in the sagas, those epic Viking soap operas, you'll see references to warriors skewering enemies mid-charge or hurling spears across rivers. It wasn't flashy like a sword, but it was reliable. And let's be real, at the end of the day, staying alive was way more crucial than looking cool. Also worth noting, the wooden shaft of the spear, usually ashwood, was durable and flexible. Vikings weren't just randomly sticking iron on sticks. This was intentional, practical engineering. The length could vary too, short spears for throwing, long ones for thrusting. Basically, a Viking could carry 2 or 3 spears without even breaking a sweat. And when you compare the cost and production time of a sword versus a spear, it's no contest. Spears were the budget-friendly killing machine of the Viking Age, accessible to farmers, traders, raiders, you name it. So while axes might get the movie posters and swords steal the spotlight, it was the humble spear that made Viking warfare truly effective. Fast to make, easy to train with, and absolutely devastating when used correctly. You want battlefield efficiency? You bring a spear. You want to impress someone at a feast? Then you bring a sword. All right, we've talked about the pointy things. Now let's talk about the shields they used that kept them alive long enough to use the pointy things. Forget everything you know about shields from video games and movies. The Viking shield wasn't some clunky dinner table strapped to your arm. It was light, fast, and essential. Basically, the medieval equivalent of a mobile force field. These bad boys were usually round, roughly 30 to 36 inches across, and made from linden wood, a soft wood that's surprisingly effective at absorbing impact. Why linden? Because it's lightweight and doesn't shatter easily, meaning you could swing it, slam it, and still have enough energy to hurl an insult at the guy charging you. And at the center, the crown jewel, the iron boss. That's the little dome in the middle, not just for looks. It protected your hand and could also be used to punch someone. Yes, Viking shields were punch-capable, so not only could you block a sword with one, you could clock the guy swinging it. Now here's where it gets tactical. Vikings didn't just hold their shields and hope for the best. They used them aggressively. A Viking warrior could bash, shove, hook, and trap with a shield. That thing was an extension of the arm and the mind. You could knock an enemy off balance, open up their defense, and follow up with a killing blow, all in one fluid motion. And let's talk formation, the legendary shield wall. This wasn't some chaotic mosh pit of screaming Norsemen. It was a disciplined, organized tactic. Picture dozens of warriors locking their shields edge to edge, creating a nearly impenetrable wall of wood and iron. The front line kept enemies at bay while spearmen jabbed from behind. It was gritty, claustrophobic, and terrifying. You know the phrase, hold the line? That literally applied here. A well-formed shield wall could resist charges, missile volleys, and even cavalry, if the Vikings had time to dig in. Archaeological finds? Tons. Shields don't always survive well, wood rots, but we've found enough iron bosses, fragments of rims, and even full reconstructions based on grave goods to piece it together. One of the best-known examples comes from the Gokstad ship burial in Norway. Several round shields were found stacked along the sides of the ship, painted in alternating yellow and black, with visible wooden planks and boss fittings. And yes, Viking shields were often painted. Bright colors, symbols, maybe even personal runes, because nothing says "fear me" like a flaming red serpent staring you down mid-battle. A painted shield wasn't just flair, it could intimidate enemies, identify you in the chaos, or tell your story at a glance. But here's the surprising bit. Shields were often intentionally light and thin, sometimes just a quarter-inch thick. That made them maneuverable, but also disposable. If your shield splintered mid-fight, no problem. That's why Vikings often carried spares when heading into battle. Shields were the first line of defense, not the last resort. And yes, despite what Hollywood wants you to believe, Vikings didn't strap them to their arms. They gripped them in the center with one hand through the iron boss. That gave them better wrist mobility, which meant more control, faster reaction time, and way cooler fight choreography. If they had TikTok back then. So no, the Viking shield wasn't just a piece of wood. It was a weapon, a strategy, and a survival tool all in one. If swords were the flex and axes were the workhorse, shields were the lifeline. You didn't go raiding without one, unless you were trying to impress Odin by checking in early. Alright, it's time. Let's finally slay the dragon of Viking fashion myths. Because the number one image people have of Vikings? Horned helmets. You've seen them on Halloween costumes, cartoons, metal album covers, and literally nowhere in actual Viking history. So here's the truth bomb. Vikings did not wear horned helmets into battle, not even once. No antlers, no wings, no Viking Barbie cosplay. The whole idea? It came from a 19th century opera, most famously Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen. Some costume designer decided, you know what would look cool? Cattle horns. And that stuck harder than a throwing axe in a monastery door. But let's talk about what Viking helmets actually looked like. The only complete Viking helmet ever found comes from Gjermundbu, Norway, dated around the 10th century. And spoiler alert, it's decidedly practical. Iron, rounded cap, eye and nose protection. No flair, no decoration. Just pure survival gear. The design? Think early medieval biker helmet, with none of the fun. It was made to deflect blows, not win fashion awards. It even had riveted iron plates and a face guard to keep your nose from becoming a battlefield casualty. But here's the thing. Helmets were rare. Like luxury item rare. Iron was expensive, and forging it into protective headgear wasn't exactly a weekend project. So only wealthier Vikings or those in professional warrior roles probably had helmets. The average raider? He was probably rocking a thick wool cap or leather hood and hoping for the best. Now let's talk body armor. Again, mail shirts did exist. They were called burnie and were made of interlocking iron rings. Solid defense, no doubt. But you had to have money or be part of a warband led by someone with money to get one. One chainmail shirt could take tens of thousands of rings and hundreds of hours to craft. It wasn't something you picked up at the market after brunch. So most warriors relied on a different kind of protection. Layers. Vikings often wore thick woolen tunics, maybe leather jerkins, or layered clothing that could absorb and deflect glancing blows. Think of it like medieval padding. It wouldn't stop a direct sword thrust, but it could save your ribs from getting cracked by a stray axe handle. And here's where Viking fighting style comes into play. They didn't rely on heavy armor because they didn't need to. Their combat style was about speed, maneuverability, and endurance. They were marathon raiders. You don't row across the North Sea for 3 days and then strap on 70 pounds of metal, unless you really hate yourself. Also worth busting, the idea that Vikings charged shirtless into battle, oiled up and screaming. While it's true that some warriors may have gone light for agility, the whole berserker bare-chested rage monster image is mostly saga hype and later myth-making. Most Vikings were practical. They wanted to survive the fight, not pose for a fantasy novel cover. And if you're thinking, but weren't they savage barbarians? Slow down. Viking warriors were disciplined, skilled, and strategic. Armor was a tool, not a personality. In other words, Vikings didn't rely on showy armor. They relied on smarts, skill, and a killer offense. And maybe a prayer to Odin if things got really dicey. So there you have it. Viking warfare, weapon by weapon. Axes that doubled as household tools. Swords that made you feel like a Norse celebrity. Spears that did all the work but got none of the glory. Shields that weren't just defense. They were tactics in circular form, and armor that was practical, not theatrical. The Vikings didn't just fight, they fought smart. And they knew that battles weren't won with flash, they were won with skill, coordination, and a really sharp blade. If you liked this breakdown of the Viking arsenal, go ahead and raid that like button, subscribe for more myth-busting medieval content, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next history deep dive. Until next time, keep your shield high and your axe sharper.